It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is the one and only Louie Giglio, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table. It's time to win the battle of your mind. Louie, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for joining us on today's show.
Thanks, Shaun. It's a privilege to be here. I'm really excited about it.
Well, I'm a guy who works in the Christian publishing space, and in my world, just about everybody knows who Louis is, but I know indefinitely somebody's going to watch or listen to this episode and be like, I have no idea who this Louis Giglio guy is. So, for the benefit of the person meeting you for the first time, give us that elevator pitch version of the Louis Giglio origin story. What are a few things we should know about you?
Yeah, that's great. Most people on planet Earth have never heard of me. So hello to everyone. I'm Louie. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I love Atlanta. Born here, lived in Texas for a minute, and that was pretty great because I met my wife there. And Texans are incredible. So shout out to all the Texans that are out there. I met my wife in Houston. We lived in Texas for a season, came back to Atlanta. Mostly, I've been involved in a movement called Passion, and that movement's been aimed at university age young people, really calling them to a Christ-centered life of glorifying God no matter what they do, what field they're in, what gift they have. And it's been a real privilege. We've been on that road for 23 years. Most recently had about 750,000 people gathered virtually, bringing in the new year for 2021, about 60,000 in a football stadium in Atlanta in 2020, maybe the last stadium event for Jesus that happened in the world in 2020. I lead a local church in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm part of an amazing team here called Passion City Church. And I love all things space. And so I've got a friend right now on the International Space Station. He might listen to this podcast at some point. He'll be up there a few more months. Shane Kimbrough, shout out Shane if you do find Shaun's podcast. And so we're really into that. And I was just emailing him a few minutes ago because we had an incredible sighting here the other night where the station came right over our second story terrace for like 3-4 minutes, just incredible view. And just helps me remember God's big and we're small, and it's a privilege to know him.
Well, Louis, if I had an award for new episode experience of the month, it'd be having a friend on the International Space Station. That's never happened before. Who knows? It may never happen again. So thank you for that fun fact. And thanks for helping us get to know you a little bit better. That context is always intriguing. Helps us know why should we be listening to you? Why should head out and pick up a copy of your brand new book? Let's transition now and get into the story behind the book. As a guy who's looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of book proposals through the years, I've seen books that have come out of blog posts, books that have come out of viral videos. This is the first time I've encountered a book that was inspired by a text message. So tell us the backstory of that text message that would shift your life.
Yeah, I reached out to a friend, Shaun, going through a really challenging season. And that's not to say that everyone listening to us hasn't been through a challenging season. So it wasn't anything unusual. We all go through them. And some of them are relational, organizational, but mostly relational. And we get sideways in a situation and things are said, things are not said. And at the end of the day, you don't want to necessarily defend yourself and try to justify everything. So often you just say, Lord, we'll just see what happens, give it time. And some time had passed and something had happened. I heard about it on the way home and it had vindicated something. And I wanted to celebrate. So I texted a friend who I knew had walked through this whole season with me and said what a lot of us say, hey, you're not going to believe what I just heard. You are not going to believe what happened today. You are not going to believe how this turned out exactly the way I thought it was going to turn out. And I really just wanted some commiseration. But this friend was an instrument of God. And I composed this long text, send it. It's the kind of text that you don't put your phone down. You just stare and you're like, I'm waiting and I'm not going anywhere till I get a response back. And I just wanted, hey, Louie, you're amazing. You're awesome. Instead, I got this little blurb back and I was like, okay, the next thing I'm going to get is going to say, sorry, I hit send too soon. Here's the rest of my message. And there was no more message. So I finally locked in on the 9 words that were on my screen and they knocked me down. The words were, don't give the enemy a seat at your table. And just in a heartbeat, Shaun, those words just cut into the clutter. And I realized these whole last 4, 5, 6 months, I've been entertaining my adversary at my table, and I've been listening to a killer. And he's the one who's been putting all of these thoughts of fear and all of this anxiety and animosity in my mind. And I just knew right then and there, I'm taking my table back right now and standing at the top of my driveway. I can tell you exactly what it looked like. And I just was like, thank you, God, for a friend who knew I didn't need commiseration. I needed a wake up call. I needed to wake up and realize that I'm not an orphan, but I'm a child of a king. And I let the enemy, the adversary, the capital E enemy, I'd let him pull up a seat at my table.
Well, as I got into the book, I don't know that I was expecting to encounter Psalm 23. I feel like a lot of us think of that's the psalm that we read at funerals. It's just encouragement for those who are grieving, but there's so much more in those verses if we're willing to actually unpack it and see what else is there. I feel like we've heard it so many times, our minds just shut off and we're like, yes, 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 I know this, I know this. Talk to us about what we're missing when we don't look at some of the specifics of Psalm 23.
Yeah, you're like me, you're a church kid. And I think any of us who grew up around church, anybody in culture, honestly, knows Psalm 23, but especially if you grew up around the church world, we've heard all of it too much, honestly. We've got spiritual amnesia and we've all gotten inoculated from the power of the gospel. And I tell you, Psalm 23 is not a sweet melody. It's not a lullaby. It's not a bedtime story. It is a gritty, gutty invitation from a guy who knew what shepherding was all about. He knew shepherding was about being a protector and a provider. He said that with his bare hands, he killed a lion and a bear. And so the guy writing this is not, yes, he's a psalm writer and a hymn writer, the greatest song and hymn writer of life, wrote most of the Psalms, but this guy was a fighter and he was a warrior and he knew what leading sheep was about. And so when he writes it, he's writing to say Jesus has got this same grit and this same determination and this same desire to lead you, to guide you, to restore you, to protect you, to provide for you. And the thing that's the knockout blow of the psalm is to prepare a table before you, verse 5, in the presence of your enemies. And that's where the two texts connected for me. The one I got from my friend and the one I got from the Spirit of God through the living word. God didn't say, I prepare a table before you in my presence. That's the way I would have written it. He said, I prepare the table before you in the presence of your enemies. So in the middle of the battle, in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the conflict, the cancer, the pandemic, the whatever's going on, I'm still able to prepare a table before you. And with that, I'm going to anoint your head with oil. And you know what else is going to happen? Your cup is going to overflow in the presence of your enemies. And it just lit me up. And I realized that no matter what is happening in my life, Jesus is inviting me to sit down with him at a table he's prepared. And everything I need is not necessarily on the table, but it is definitely in the person who's at the table with me. And Psalm 23 has come alive for me. It's come alive in a brand new way. This all happened maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I've never seen the psalmist the same, and I've never seen the psalm the same since.
And in terms of the enemy being at our table, I feel like we often will accept that as a norm, as just something that we're going to have to deal that. Should we be assuming that's how it always has to be, or is there hope that it can be far different?
Yeah, I think lie number one of the enemy is this is just the way it is. I mean, that's the most subtle, sellable lie that there is. Hey, your mom was a worrier, your grandmom was a worrier, the Johnsons, we're just worriers. Or, this is the way you were born and this was the situation you had to deal with. So this is just the way life's going to be for you. You've got anxiety. We all have anxiety. Hey, anxiety is just a part of the deal. And I think that lie is the most believed lie of all of the lies. Is that it's just going to be this way and it can't change. And I think that that's antithetical or antithetical to get the right word out, to the gospel, because it doesn't have to be that way. And if it did, Jesus would have stayed on his throne in heaven and he would have never had to come out of the tomb. But because it didn't have to be this way, he stepped off of his throne in heaven. And because it didn't have to be this way, God raised him up out of death, hell, sin, and the grave. And so two major things have happened in our lives to show us that it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that coming through 2020, particularly, and even now in 2021, the hangover effect of 2020 is going to last 2 or 3 years. And people are going to still be using, and I say this very much as a human being who has lived through a pandemic, but we're going to be using the excuse of COVID, I would guess, for at least the next 2 to 5 years. And, oh, the reason why we didn't do that, COVID. Oh, the reason why we didn't open our business, COVID. The reason why we couldn't offer you that, COVID. The reason why we couldn't get this back off the ground, COVID. The reason I'm this way, COVID. The reason I reacted like that when I just did, COVID. And it's just it's a cop out. And COVID was hard, and it is hard, and it's real, and it caused a lot of loss, death, pain, hardship, and the shock factor is going to be real for a long time. But it's not greater than Jesus, and it's not greater than the power of the gospel. And so I think we start with everything can change. And that's the first step towards winning the battle of your mind.
And at a practical level, when the enemy bellies up to the table and says, "Hey, I'm going to join you guys," um, how do we push back? How do we fight the enemy's presence? There's got to be some real practical, tangible, actionable ways to do that. 'Cause I feel like a lot of times people will read a book like this and they'll remember some of the concepts, but they fail to actually take the action steps and do the takeaways. So, what are ways that we, in the moment, can fight back against the enemy's presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that even the title, this book's title, I believe, is an actionable step. And because I knew when the text came from my friend, I didn't need a follow-up text. I didn't need to text him back and go, how do I do that? How do I not let the enemy have a seat at my table? I knew right away, just by acknowledging the fact that he's at the table is step one. And so that's the first actionable step, is to get the title into the fabric of your framework and the filter by which you see everything that happens in your life. We get something like, 9,000 thoughts at a minimum come into our mind every day. And we have to steward that process. We can't just say, well, I don't know where that thought came from and it's sitting there. We have to be the initiator of the investigation and say, wait a minute, where did you come from? And who sent you here? Are you coming from my shepherd or somewhere else? And if you know God's heart, his character, his will, and his word, then you'll know right away where that thought came from. And so it's first just having an awareness. The enemy's trying to get at my table. Secondly, it's knowing the character, heart, ways, and the word of God, so that when the thought comes into our mind, we have some way to investigate it. Where did you come from? And then I think the third step is just to activate. If that thought did not come from God, then I've got to take authority. I've got to step up. I have to activate and animate. I've got to get involved. I can't just sit back and go, well, that's a terrible thought, but man, I don't know how to get rid of it. The way you get rid of it is by taking authority over it in Jesus' name. And then the fourth thing I would say to people is you have to replace a thought. So if I were to tell you, Shaun, if you said, hey, I've been having these really depressive thoughts, or I've had this really angry thought, or I've had this, whatever thought, what do I do? I wouldn't say to you, Shaun, you've got to stop thinking about that. You've got to stop thinking about that. Don't think about that anymore. The more I say that to you, A, the more you're going to think about it, and B, the more you're going to be afraid that you can't stop thinking about it. And so instead, I would say, man, you got to find something else to think about. And I'll give you a great example. One of the big lies of the enemy is you're not going to make it through this. And he's been telling us all that through the last year. You're not going to survive this. But yet the only way he can tell us that I love this, is because we've survived everything we've been through. So he couldn't even tell me that lie if I hadn't already made it through everything I've been through in life. So he's not standing on too good a ground when he says I'm not going to make it because, well, hello, I have made it. But I can't just take that and say, oh, I don't want to think about the fact that I'm not going to make it. What I encourage people to do is write that down. I'm not going to make it through this divorce. I'm not going to make it through this season. I'm not going to make it through this collapse of my business. I'm not going to make it through this time with my kid. Um, and then to write the truth above it. And what would I write above it? God has brought me through every challenge I've ever been through. And then I would go down and cross out the lie and I would circle what's on the top. And I would start making that my narrative. And when the enemy said, you're not going to make it, I would say, you know what? The truth is, I've actually seen God bring me through every challenging day I've been through. And that's my new story. That's my new narrative. Doesn't change the circumstance, still very hard, but God has brought me through every challenge I've ever been through.
Yeah, it's almost like we're renewing our mind with the power of our actual own testimony. We don't even need to listen to somebody else's testimony. We can remind ourselves of all the great works that God has done throughout our life, keeping us moving forward, both in good times and in bad. As I was listening to the audiobook, now this next question relates to a point where my ears just perked up. I was like, ooh, I feel like this is a key thing, at least for me, from the book. You know, the enemy will often want us to be defined by our scars, but in God's grace, Jesus's scars come into play on our behalf, and just that exchange, kind of what I picked up as I was listening to the book is like, oh, that this is a very profound point for me. So talks about how the enemy wants to remind us of our scars, but how as Jesus' scars come into play, that's a game changer.
Man, I'm with you on that. You know, my heart perked up pretty strong too around that idea. Um, I've got a big scar on my hand I'm looking at right now on my left hand, and it's real. Part of the reason why it semi traumatizes me, even looking at it right now, is my mom was a classic underreactor. And so when I almost cut my thumb off with a Swiss Army knife my dad had brought me home from his trip to Europe, my mom was just like, let's put a Band-Aid on it, and head off to second grade tomorrow, or whatever grade I was in. And 2 weeks later, when gangrene was setting in to my hand, and I had to go and have a doctor do this deep cleanse of this gashing wound on my hand, it began to slowly heal. And so, you have to deal with the wound. So that's not what we're saying, just because I don't want anybody to, fall off the conversation right here. We're not saying what happened to you doesn't matter and that you don't need to treat the wound. But in time, with God's help, wounds heal. And that doesn't mean there's not a scar there. But I had a friend who had spent a lot of years cutting themselves. And I mean, their arms from their wrist all the way onto their biceps actually were just, I mean, too many scars to count. And in the summertime when I met them, they had a long sleeve shirt on, and I was like kind of guessing. And I said, hey, do you mind me just asking, have you ever cut yourself? And they were like, yeah. And they pulled their sleeve up. And that person was obviously trying to cover up a whole season of life. And I understood that. I got it, because those scars represent failure, disappointment, shame, self-harm, the enemy being at my table. But God had redeemed this person, and he was winning the battle in their mind. And I said, you know what? I haven't been in your shoes, and I don't have cutting marks on my arms, but I hope and pray there's a day that you can put on a short sleeve shirt and walk with your head as high as you can. Because when people look at your arm, you're going to be able to tell them, I know, isn't it amazing that I'm here in my right mind by the grace of God? And the reason is, just to wrap the idea, Shaun, is because of his scars. And so people don't think about this, but Jesus is the God man. So he's always going to be the God man. When he went back into heaven, he didn't separate and go back to just being God. He's the God man eternal. And so the scars didn't go away when he appeared to the disciples. They were still there. He got healed instantly when he got raised from the dead. He's got this resurrection glow on his body. He's got this I'm ascending to the Father thing going on. But he said to Thomas, come stick your finger in the holes and stick them in this big old gash in my side. That's proof that it's me. And so I would just say to anyone listening today, God respects your wound. He wants to move in and do whatever it takes to heal it. And then he wants you to stop staring at it and to start staring at the wounds that are in his hands and feet, because those wounds tell you who you are, not your wounds. His wounds tell you that you're loved, that you're prized, that you're a victor, that you matter, and that he's more powerful.
Well, almost time for us to wrap up here, but I got a couple closing questions. One of the things I like to remind people on as many times as I can on the podcast is that we're all leaders, we're all influencers. If you're a mom or a dad, you're influencing your kids. If you're just a kid growing up, you also influence friends and those people around you. So, when I talk about leaders, I'm not just thinking of people on a stage or people who are running an organization. We all lead in some capacity throughout the
Yeah.
different spheres that we influence. So how can we be better leaders by resisting the enemy? If we resist the enemy, how does it spill over into our relationships and the things that we touch by what we do and what we say?
Oh, wow. I mean, 1,000 ways, but let's focus on just one or two. I think number one, leaders have to be creators. There are leaders that are managers and maintainers, but I would say those are managers more than leaders. A leader's job is to see the future that maybe hasn't yet been seen and to help cast a vision for people to get there. So a leader is creating. He's either creating a company or a business or a product or an idea or a brand or a church or a family. A leader's creating. If the enemy's at my table, then I'm fearful, I'm resentful, I'm protective, I'm always looking over my shoulder, and I'm defensive. That's a sign number one that the enemy's at your table. I'm not open to other people's ideas or criticism. All these things, what they're doing is they're suffocating the creative process of a leader. And instead of me spending today utilizing the energy that I have and the gift of today to make something beautiful for the world that gives God glory and helps people, I spent today worrying about 8 things that 7 of them aren't even going to happen today. Or I spent today trying to mentally control something that honestly I don't have control over. And I think it's just relinquishing our minds into the control of the Spirit of God and then putting our hands to do what God has given us to do today. And too many leaders are fighting fights they don't need to be fighting and worrying about things they don't need to be worrying about and protecting things they don't need to protect and trying to control things they don't even have control over. And they're sacrificing the opportunity they had today to make something beautiful for the world. So at the end of today, I don't want to say, who did I argue with in my mind and what battle did I win against so-and-so in my mind? I want to say at the end of today, what did I contribute to someone's life today? How did I help and serve someone today? So that's number one. And then I think just a quick second, we need to see people and love them. And when the enemy is at your table and you're a leader, you have a tendency to use people more than to love people. And I think that getting the enemy away from the table, it allows me to look at the shepherd and see the way he's treating me. And then I want to then treat people the way I'm being treated. And a good leader wants to treat people the way that the leader, the good shepherd, is treating them.
Wow, that serves an amen. I love that. As our gaze falls back onto Jesus, we are reminded, we are empowered to treat others how He is treating us. I love that. That's a good place to wrap up. Louis, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where do we discover you on the web?
LouieGiglio.com. That's the best place. Everything kind of ties into there. Any social media platform, Louie Giglio. There's not too many Louie Giglios floating around. So you can find me on any social platform there, but louiegiglio.com, and that links to Passion City Church, Passion Conference, the book, other stuff.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes to places where you can connect with Louie and pick up your very own copy of his brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Louie Giglio. Once again, our book today was Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table. It's time to win the battle of your mind. Again, for more on Louie, check out his website. You can find that at louiegiglio.com. And Louie, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Shaun, thanks. It's been an honor for me as well. Blessings on everything you do.